In 1977, still out of work and with no job offers as a commercial pilot, Mollnow was ordered to appear before an Air Force Board of Inquiry, a board appointed not to look into his hazard reports or psychiatric tests, but only to investigate the obscene letters. And on December 9th, 1977, Mollnow was discharged, honorably discharged, from the Air Force. Ironically, while he had been grounded, the Air Force Reserve promoted him to major and cited his fine record. Since his discharge, Mollnow has had little to do with the Air Force until the 21st reunion of his old aviation cadet class in Phoenix earlier this year. 10 of the 150 members of that class had died in airplane accidents, and the group had permission to honor these missing flyers in the chapel at nearby Luke Air Force Base, where many of them had flown. But when 60 Minutes showed up to film Mollnow for this report, the class, all former Air Force pilots, wasn't allowed in the chapel or on the base.
It was not intended to be a media event. Therefore, the Air Force position is that there will be no memorial service.
I think it's a shame that we're not allowed on the base, or at least in a chapel. I can see where they wouldn't allow us in restricted areas. But to go to the base chapel, it's unreasonable.
They went ahead with the memorial service anyway in a rented motel room. If Mollnow got into trouble because he wouldn't straighten out and fly the Air Force way, Lieutenant Frank Alvarez got into trouble for making waves about a most sensitive issue in the U.S. Navy: years of racial discrimination in the senior service. Race riots aboard the carrier Kitty Hawk in 1972 had given urgency to Admiral Elmo Zumwalt's new race relations program. One of the first instructors in the compulsory seminars for blacks and whites was Lieutenant Junior Grade Frank Alvarez.
That's what Admiral Zumwalt wanted with the program, was to have one Navy, not a black Navy, not a white Navy, but one Navy.
Like Mollnow, Alvarez had a spotless record. He came up through the ranks, won his commission in a reserve program, and was Minority Affairs Officer at Great Lakes Naval Base outside Chicago. After 6 weeks of training, the young lieutenant began teaching the race seminars. But it wasn't long before Alvarez's commanding officer was getting complaints about a technique called confrontation that was supposed to identify latent prejudice. Alvarez says his CO told him not to use the technique. But when Alvarez insisted it was part of the program and persisted, there was a meeting with the base psychiatrist.
He told me primarily two things. Number one, that I had upset the Admiral over on Main side. And after upsetting the Admiral, the commanding officer here had received a second complaint concerning the seminar, and what he planned on doing was to have me undergo a psychiatric exam.
The Navy won't let us go in there. This is the base hospital at Great Lakes, where the locked psychiatric unit is located. The chief psychiatrist has called it a grim-looking unit, even depressing. In September of 1974, Lieutenant Alvarez was told he could come here voluntarily or he would be ordered to report. After declining to undergo the psychiatric evaluation voluntarily, Alvarez was ordered to report to the hospital. He remained in the locked psychiatric ward for a week.
My responsibilities were to wipe down the basins in the kitchen, to sweep the floor, empty out trash cans.
Frank Alvarez was imprisoned in a locked psychiatric ward without cause, illegally, without due process of law.
Attorney Ron Clark represents Alvarez in a $1 million lawsuit that charges Navy officers abused the lieutenant and violated his civil rights.
It was to prevent Frank from carrying out his lawful orders of his superiors and to prevent Frank from implementing the race relation program in the Navy.
According to medical records, Alvarez was admitted for an unspecified personality disorder. But after extensive tests and examinations, the psychiatrist found nothing wrong, no mental illness. His recommendation, return him to full active duty. But while he was here, that race relations program at Great Lakes had been abruptly canceled. And within a year, Alvarez, against his will, was piped out of the Navy. His discharge was honorable. The Navy says he was let go because of budget cuts. But before getting his walking papers, Alvarez was assigned to inventory duty at Great Lakes, then transferred to another base.
It's a shattering experience, and people who are then removed from the service by this mechanism feel totally frustrated and helpless. The law isn't very clear about it. It's a very helpless situation.
Whether Frank Alvarez or Carl Mollnow ever get their day in court may ultimately be decided here at the United States Supreme Court. Now, generally, the courts don't like to interfere in military matters, particularly with orders between commanding officers and their men. Under the 1950 Feres Doctrine, neither the government nor commanding officers can be sued for official conduct. The court said you simply can't run an army that way.
The argument has certainly been made that if you give Frank Alvarez his day in court, somehow the entire military structure in the United States is going to come tumbling down. I think that that's ludicrous.
I see nowhere in my record that it has that I was court-martialed. Nowhere in my record does it show that I've gone AWOL. No disciplinary action. We so many times tell our children to do the best they can, just like my parents had encouraged me as I was growing up. And here I come in and do hopefully 20 years of good service to my country, and it seems like I get it ripped out from underneath me as a result of this incident up at Great Lakes Naval Base.
No 20 years, no pension. After 16 years in the Navy, it was over. We asked Dr. Bragan if what happened to Frank Alvarez and Carl Mollnow had overtones of Soviet psychiatry.
In this country, you don't have many people put into institutions strictly for political reasons. But when psychiatrists begin to get involved in things like this letter, where specifically it's stated that we're having political problems with this individual, can you help us out with a medical diagnosis? That is Soviet psychiatry at its worst. And in this case, it's American psychiatry at its worst, and it looks an awful lot like Soviet psychiatry.
Ultimately, you have to put the service ahead of the individual, because the overall service is what we're trying to keep at maximal readiness and maximal effectiveness. That's what it's for, to defend the country. And you sometimes have to set aside individual considerations in favor of the larger whole.
As we said earlier, there is a legal question whether Carl Mollnow and Frank Alvarez will ever get their day in court. But last November, the Supreme Court agreed to hear a similar case, a case involving the right of former military men to sue their superior officers for violation of constitutional rights. Whether or not an individual has that right once in the armed forces is the question the justices must decide.